Our next session is on the democratization of information and the profound influence it's had on culture over time as it's enabled the spread of ideas. With the availability of information through the internet and social media, people now have greater access to knowledge, news, and diverse perspectives than ever before. We will begin this panel in just one moment once the crew finishes setting up. I will introduce the moderator for this panel, and he will introduce his esteemed panelists. Our moderator is Tom Wainwright. He's tech and media editor at The Economist, and they will join you shortly.
Well, thank you very much, Ramia, for your introduction. It's fantastic to be here at this great cultural festival. We were just saying backstage we've got a particularly hard act to follow after that amazing performance by Jay Ivey. I'm afraid none of us is planning to sing, at least as far as I know. But I've every confidence that our absolutely stellar panel will entertain you just as much. Let me start by introducing them. We have Nanjira Sambuli, Fellow in Technology and International Affairs at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We have Anthony Geffen, a documentary filmmaker and the Chief Executive of Atlantic Productions, and Wolfgang Fengler, the Chief Executive of the World Data Lab. And before we start, I just want to say as a quick note to the audience, we're going to have time at the end of this session for some questions from the audience. So while we're all chatting away, please be sharpening your questions that you can ask when you get control of the microphone at the end. So to kick off, I just wanted to start by unpacking today's subject a little bit. We're calling it the democratization of information. It's a slightly cryptic subject, and I wanted to come up with an example of what we mean by this in practice. And I was thinking about this, and I think in a way, perhaps the best example I could think of was the very discussion that we're having right now. If you imagine us having this conversation at a conference like this, say 20 years ago, think about how that information would have been disseminated. Well, we would have had the live audience here, and it would have gone out to you guys. Maybe if a journalist had been here, it would have made it into the press the next day, but that would have been just about it. Contrast that with the situation that we have here today. Again, we have the live audience, but probably the majority of people seeing this event will be seeing it in the future when it's put on YouTube, which I believe the organizers are doing. And not just that, but obviously everybody here in the audience has the means to live stream this themselves, to put it on Twitter, to comment on threads, on Instagram, whatever you like. So we're in a world now where everybody is a potential content producer, and everybody through their phone has access to an extraordinary amount of information, much of it for free. So there's been a revolution in both the production and the consumption of media, and it's had a profound impact on our culture. So this is what I'm hoping we can dissect a bit in today's discussion. And I thought perhaps we could start, Nanjira, with you. If you're able to give us an overview of the key technological changes that have enabled this democratization of information that we're talking about, that would be great.
Sure. Three come to mind. The internet itself, mobile devices that have gotten the internet into the hands of a lot more people, and then social media, which has been built over the internet and is evolving. The three have disrupted both the production and consumption side, as you put it, but more significantly have brought to fore cultures that were not sort of profiled typically in the media arrangements that we've had before. And you think about a globalized world where a majority are not necessarily visible in how media or culture is consumed. And that's been beautiful to see. That has coincided with interesting dimensions, such as younger generations being the ones at the forefront in parts of Africa, Latin America, Asia, and elsewhere. And so there's been a remembrance, present-day culture as is sort of diffused into different parts of the world. And all of these things have come together in such interesting and profound ways as far as media today goes.
Can you give any examples of particular kinds of culture that perhaps are more visible now than they were in the past? Are you thinking of anything in particular?
Sure. I think musically, for example, South African music, Nigerian music, and Afrobeat, for example, it's not just about platforms like Spotify that have been able to bring them to the sort of listenership with streaming. It's also about the culture that has been curated alongside that to be visibilized through these social media, and even just representation of certain people on media. I think one favorite example of mine that comes to mind is our friends from CNN will recall their interactions with Kenyans. My people from Kenya once had a hashtag, someone tell CNN, to really counter what they felt was a misrepresentation of events in the country. And it's happened twice in quick succession, and I think since then we've seen markedly different coverage of the issues that happen in that part of the world as a result of that. And that was quite significant as an assertion that we're not just a people in an area that has, say, terrorism or other things that were sort of archetypes of what is covered in that part of the world. And so that's been really, really impressive to see about the demand, even from mainstream or established media and cultural enterprises, to showcase that if you're going to borrow or if you're going to speak to areas of the world, you have to represent them for what they are.
So the mainstream media is being challenged in a way by new media and held to account.
Yeah.
That's probably very good for us. I thought, Anthony, I might ask a similar question to you. You work in all kinds of media, but for the time being, if we just focus on video, I'm interested in how your art form has been changed over the years by these changes in technology that we're talking about, these new platforms, whether that's streaming like Netflix or YouTube. How has this affected the kind of art form that you work in?
Well, I think there's been a massive proliferation, hasn't there, everywhere in terms of film and video. I think one of the interesting things about video is that when it first arrived and we started streaming, it was incredible, wasn't it? You were able to see events you couldn't see anywhere in the world. You were able to engage. You were able to understand things in a new way. But I think what's interesting, I remember talking to the head of YouTube in his first year, and he said to me, my medium is going to spawn 1 million Spielbergs. And that didn't happen. There's the difference between video and what it supplies and actually storytelling. And I think my worry about video in some ways now, especially in the social media, is that it's used as clickbait. It's used in algorithms. It's used to sort of bring about what I call the 1 minute or 30-second attention span. And that's worrying, I think, and I think you add on top of that what's real and what's not real, what's deep fake, what's fake news. We've now moved from an extraordinary beginning to something that we need to be concerned about. And I think so much now has become less about storytelling and understanding and more about sensationalism.
Do you think it's interesting? You talked about short video and short attention spans. Have you noticed a change in appetite among the audience? Do people expect a different kind of format now?
Well, I obviously work on the whole in the long form, and what's interesting, and I've been lucky enough to make, for example, 17 projects with David Attenborough. What I've learned is that actually people, adults and children, actually have a much longer concentration span. They want to engage in things, they want to be involved, but we're in a world now where the attention span's so short, and everybody thinks that's all they want, and it's absolute rubbish. I mean, I took David to 1 billion people, and we proved that we could take really quite big subjects, not just about the natural world, but about the consequences of what will happen in the natural world to lots and lots of people. And so I think that's what we have to take control of now. We have to realize we can tell stories, and we can tell stories about important things, and everybody doesn't have a concentration span of a newt.
The difficulty is
That's being unfair to newt, sorry.
The trouble is we're at the mercy of algorithms, aren't we? And they tend to resurface the stuff which is most immediately engaging. And I wonder, how can we help to steer people towards the more, whether that's the long form stuff, the more kind of wholesome stuff, the more nutritious stuff, if you like. How do we do that, Nigeria? I
think Anthony is right that people do want it. The trouble has been the systems that deliver this to us have gone through what I would call an algorithmification. This idea that if you're a media exec, if short stories work and they're a hit, suddenly all that you commission is actually short stories or horror stories or whatever. And that algorithmification of the industries that then serve us the content is the problem. It's not so much about engineering our attention spans. The few breakthrough successes we've had, whether it's in books, media, film and everything else, show us that there's always room for improvement in the sort of production side, in meeting people for the complexity that we present as people. Today we may want to watch 2 seconds, tomorrow we want to watch 24 hours of something. Just make that available, and I think that pushes the buck to the industries that we have today, rather than saying, let's, I don't know how would hurt people to watch nature documentaries. Either you present them or you don't. That's the beauty of life. But we have to make sure the industry is creative in itself to deliver this.
And one of the ways possibly of engaging people more in this kind of content is through new immersive media. And Anthony, we've talked a bit about your video work, but these days you're doing a lot of stuff in these new formats. So you gave me a go earlier with the Vision Pro from Apple, and I still feel a bit dizzy from that, to be honest. It was an extraordinary experience. Can you tell us about how new technology like that is going to engage people further?
Well, I genuinely think, it's hard to see it, but in the next 2 to 3 years, we are going to go through a radical change where we're going to start to move away from what I call the smartphone generation towards the immersive generation. Now, why is that possible? How is that possible? Well, it's not just possible because of headsets, it's possible because of technology. We've had a massive convergence recently of technology we can use to build onto new platforms to tell stories in different ways. We have gaming platforms, haptics, LiDAR, AI, you name it. Put all that together, and you see glimpses of this in the Vision Pro. The Vision Pro is the beginning of a journey of spatial computing. There are lots of other people who will join that journey, but I can tell you, I remember when we started the smartphone generation, it was extraordinary. It suddenly just took off, and it opened our eyes. The beauty of and it's difficult because people in the room probably haven't seen the Pro, the Vision Pro. It's absolutely not just another VR device, but it opens the way to a very different kind of storytelling, a very different kind of engagement, a way that you can actually communicate, shell stories outwards rather than inwards. You can travel to places. And I think that, it's going to create a change over the next 2 to 3 years, which is going to help us in many, many different ways. But one of the areas I'm concentrating on in the beginning of all this is education and health. Because if you imagine a device that you put on your head in a good way that can tell how you're feeling and how you're interacting, imagine how powerful that device can be for a kid. A kid could see whether they're getting better at maths or French or Arabic or whatever. Somebody who is sick can be monitored very carefully. We've done a program, for example, in China, where we've taken millions and millions of women through pregnancy in rural areas who now just have to put a simple headset on, who can follow the stages of pregnancy. In America, we've worked on it with autism. It's a whole new platform, and all I can tell you is, having been involved in it for a while, it's a very, very exciting beginning of something new. But I'm most excited because I think the device, when it comes down from 4,000 quid a unit, which it will, and it can be used on other platforms anyway, I think we're going to see it's going to help flatten the world, because if I've got projects in South Africa and the homelands, I've got projects in India, where we're bringing thousands of kids in a test experiment who have never been to school. And within 6 months, we're putting them a year ahead of every kid that's in school. That means somebody who was never going to go to school now wants to be a doctor, wants to go to the moon. And that's what we have to do in this world. We have to have devices and technology which can actually get out there and bridge the gap that exists in this world. And I really believe this is an opportunity, if it's used properly, to do that.
That's an interesting point, because I've heard some people make the perhaps more obvious point that, you know, a very expensive new device might not flatten the world. You know, it could do the opposite if something...
This is the beginning. This is just,
right.
this is just the prototype, what you're seeing, really, in a way, a very sophisticated prototype. But come on, we're very good at adapting technology. And I think we're going to see a unit, you know, I've used very simple units that cost $40 in China to help women who are pregnant through pregnancy, and they can fly through their own bodies. You know, this will proliferate. But I think what I'm excited about is it has the potential to engage people. And you today just experimented with it. This isn't a 30-second medium. You were engaged for minutes on certain things. Imagine what that will do for a kid. Imagine what that will do for adult education. But more importantly, it's fun. And I think we can put entertainment in that as well, of course. But it's a whole new world. And I just wish the room luck soon in getting their hands on a Pro. Just have a look at it and look at that platform. That platform is about to radically change things.
Nanjira, you look at the uptake of technology across the world. Do you see something like this as having the potential to flatten the world, or the opposite? How do you see it?
I think it's complicated, as life is, in the sense that we're still waiting for the divide even in smartphone access to be flattened. But I think the spirit of what Anthony is saying is less about the technology and more about the accessibility and democratizing access, including creation. Because part of the challenge we have today in a globalized world is this idea that it has to be Vision Pro, that is created somewhere else and then brought to certain parts of the world. But how do you make it possible that those kids in that environment actually create the equivalent based on what their expertise is? And how does that feed that ecosystem and even, you know, go to other ecosystems? Those remain the sort of soft unspokens that have sort of powered this divide, and we speak of digital divides now, but partly because there's still an assumption that there are producers and then there are consumers, and these tend to follow historical injustice and inequity lines.
I want to change gears a bit now and just think about all this abundance of information that we referred to earlier. There's so much content out there now, so much information. How on earth do we marshal all that information and make use of it? And Wolfgang, this is very much the focus of World Data Lab. I mean, you guys are experts in helping people find that data needle in the haystack, if you like. Can you talk us through what strategies you use to help people make the most of all this abundance of information now that it's all out there?
Well, thank you for this, Tom, and it's exactly as the previous presenters outlined. There's a lot of data, a lot of information. Never believe anyone who said there's enough data. That person was lazy. There is data. It's new data from the sky, from the phones, from Vision Pro, elsewhere. The key is to make sense of the numbers and then convey them. And I think some of this, what I heard now and earlier, is also a challenge to what you could call the mainstream media. I think you're representing it, but you're representing the best and the less boring part of it. But I think the mainstream, all of us, have two faults. One, we are too boring, and we need to become interesting. And I think we shouldn't impose, that's why I a bit disagree with what's been said before, we shouldn't impose our views. Let other people decide, empower them to find things, and not assume we know the solution and the answer. And second, don't be so negative. Why is every news negative? There's a lot of positive things out in the world, and create some balance. And these two things, make news less negative and more interesting, I think is part of the challenge. And so let me give you one example that's been discussed earlier today, and that's discussed in this country since COP. We launched the World Emissions Clock. Look it up, World Emissions Clock. We also launched the World Poverty Clock and many other tools that cover the whole world. So what does the World Emission Clock tell us? The world tells us, which you know, we have a problem. That's a problem, but everybody knows this, and we don't need to repeat there's a climate crisis. We heard it often enough. Let's not bore people. The question is there some glimmer of hope? Is there some new interesting element? And so here's two numbers that may be of interest to you. One is the number 43, the other is the number 21. 43 countries have declining emissions today. 21 countries have declining per capita emissions. That means 64 countries. That's a lot of countries that are going somehow in the better direction than we thought. One of the countries, interestingly, that relates to the panel in the morning, is not Canada. Canada is going the wrong direction. Canada is one of the worst G20 emitters per capita. The US is way better than Canada, but it's still very bad. The US has declining emission by roughly 180 million tons over the last 2 years. 180 million tons. There's as much half of this country emissions and half of Spain. And this country, unfortunately, is as bad as Spain, although Spain is much bigger. So the US is still the problem, together with China, but we published actually a piece that says, have we reached peak emissions? And it will come to go down, and there'll be countries that will marry consumption and climate. And that's where we want to have to be, because people want to be rich. We should not have stop people and Kenyans from becoming rich. We need to be a spot to be rich and clean. And there's 4 countries. I'll tell you in the second round which countries these are, and there's a few others. And that's the spot we should be at. You can grow in a cleaner way. And this is one of the narratives, as one example, that you can generate with good data that hopefully is not as boring as the alternative.
We spoke a bit earlier on about bridging the digital divide and flattening the world and so on. Can you tell us a bit about how you see the role of World Data Lab and organizations like yours in democratizing access to this kind of data? Do you think that there's a role to play there?
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. And there's 2 ways. One is to really be global. We don't need data for Germany and the US. There's out there enough. We can make it better, more interesting. We need data for the Central African Republic and Cambodia and Chile. That's the kind of data we need. And we have it for every country. And you can actually model it, and you can use spatial data to find insights. And that's why our data sets always have 180 countries. And we do our best to give you the best number, and if you think there's a better number, tell us, and we'll make the number better. And that's, I think, the one key thing. Everybody should be reflected in this, because everyone counts, and everyone counts for us. That's our motto. The second thing is, most of our data is available for free, so you can access it, you can download it. The World Poverty Clock is very popular, the World Emissions Clock. And maybe to close on this segment, we have also an Internet Poverty Index. We try to frame internet as a key essential need of this century. Essential needs are not anymore just food and shelter and clothes, but also access to internet. And an interesting number is 20 cents per day. That's the cheapest that's out there for a minimum package. That's $6 a month. Pakistan has achieved that. Kenya is not there yet, but Kenya is getting there. And these are I think, the kind of stories we need to generate, because it's not just, it goes always in one direction, always everything is expensive. No, in some countries, some circumstances, things are cheap and can be made cheaper. Kenya, for example, is better than South Africa. Pakistan is better than Kenya. So with this package, you can get access. These people have the basic package, and that then adds to the closing of the divide. But the divide has been closing. The world is getting better in terms of the internet. Slow by slow, but that is actually an easier challenge than, say, the fake news challenge or the climate challenge.
You were saying a minute ago that people who create content have to avoid the trap of just being negative all the time, even though audiences often seem to like that stuff. And the onus has to be on them to just be come up with stuff that's more interesting. And Anthony, you're a professional content maker who has succeeded in doing things which are both interesting and not negative. Can you tell us, what's the secret of telling an engaging story without resorting to kind of negativism? Do you find that audiences respond to positive messages?
The trouble is, I was trained at the BBC. I was extremely lucky, and I was there 10 years to learn my craft. And what you learn is that storytelling is actually a craft. It isn't just something you switch on, some editing device and whack stuff together. That's fine. You can perfectly well do that. And I think that's the art we've lost. So once you start to break things down in the story, and I'm talking about a factual story now, you work out pretty quickly the ways that you can tell it so that you can keep an audience. And you also have to be careful how you do it. I remember with Attenborough, when we were tackling some of the big things about the environment, what we realized is that if we actually hit everybody over the head in the first 10 minutes, that actually people felt there was nowhere to go. So a much more sensitive approach for something like that with the natural world was to take it on and then gradually get the audience to understand why, for example, the Great Barrier Reef is the most incredible habitat, and if you destroy it, you're destroying a massive ecosystem. But then bring in the idea that if you start to dismantle that or mine coal and many other things that can destroy it, you're going to cause a problem. And that's a sort of narrative approach. The same way when I work with Hawking. Hawking's stuff is incredibly difficult to understand. I remember when I first bought his book, when I was very young and open. I didn't understand a damn word of the book. So I had the difficulty of working with Hawking of translating his ideas. And you would have said, well, only 10 people were going to watch. Absolutely not. I mean, the stuff we put together, went out to millions and millions of people. It's learning a way of, in a world where we've got attention spans going down, but also a world where it's harder to get eyeballs. We have to work harder as storytellers. You can keep the integrity and you can speak to the world, is my view. But it's hard work, and I think a lot of news organizations on long-form storytelling and a lot of storytelling companies have lost that, and they think the clever way to do it is just to get some rap artist at the front or find some way of without a proper story, and that doesn't work. You have to tell a comprehensive story and really work to think it through. It's a hard thing to do, like anything.
So storytellers have to work harder, but what about audiences?
I want to pick up on that and borrow from Wolfgang's, call for us to not be boring and think, so I come from a place in the world that is, we are storytellers by default. And there's a lovely saying that stories are just data with soul. And why I say that is because where we find ourselves now in a sort of globalized world and where much seems to be in crisis, we have not learned enough from certain cultures that have not been spotlighted or platformed in the way we're used to. So that for those for whom storytelling is so natural, they don't have the industries yet, sort of that has given the visibility, the resources to show how it can be done. Previously, it has been that, somebody will come in, let's say Wolfgang will come into my place, he'll listen to my story, put it in some data form and go out and put it on The Economist, right? But what these technologies are doing is we're seeing as more people can also create, rather than the negative stories, as you were saying, the sort of binary of negative and positive, you see people telling very, gut-wrenching stories of despair, but with humor, with satire, with other instruments that have not been, the range, for lack of a better way to put it, is just not in mainstream media at the point. And so how do we then use the collective good of what we're able to see, the visibility of ideas that weren't previously informing what we have today, to help us think differently and not to assume that there's everything that we needed to know about how to do this has been done. And that's the beauty of culture over time. We have an opportunity here to actually learn, and I have to say learn and not extract purely from certain cultures, certain places in the world, come and, package them and then sell them back. There's an opportunity here to work with these different frictions to actually build, I think, a globalized culture of the times we're living in, but the one that respects that there have been different sources that we haven't tapped into yet.
And these new technologies enable that, you think?
Absolutely, absolutely. So it's not that we don't have a Vision Pro in the Central African Republic, but there may be a TikTok account there that helps us see the story of what's happening. And some of the crises we're living through today, it's so beautiful to see that people are linking how common it is. Before you go buy a Vision Pro, you have consumers now being like, well, we need to know about the conditions under which the minerals that have been extracted to build this platform are. And the telling of those stories is not telling the story of those people as just helpless, but the story of these people as people with agency, people who have hopes and dreams. This is already happening. So the question is whether industry is going to absorb that, or is going to be disrupted, and we're all just going to be consuming very differently from what is platformed.
Yeah.
I think just to build on Nanjira's, indeed, absolutely, I think that's what happened in terms of the democratization of that space, right? As you said at the beginning, 20 years ago, there would have been a certain type of consumption, but people should have just taken it or leave it. But today, my daughter, by the way, she's an influencer. She's quite successful on TikTok and Instagram, and she actually is called Natalie's Happy Life in Amsterdam, and it's a student life, and it's okay. If people want to have 30 seconds TikTok, then they should do it. I think we should not impose that. Others do 3 hours cinema thing is also okay, but I think we should not let them take it on and then decide. And on the negativity, I'm not obviously arguing for just positive. I want balance, but I want more positivity because that would balance with the negativity. Obviously, we all know, and this is how our brains are wired and how our ancestors have been operating because they had to run away from the lions, that fear is much more sensitized and negative news is more extreme. The fact that today, again, 10,000 Vietnamese escaped poverty, nobody noticed because it's just the way it happens and it's a small number, while an earthquake is obviously a much bigger number. But I would love to have is somehow to balance the Great Barrier Reef degradation that is real and serious with a story about Switzerland Romania, Malta, or Chile, which are actually clean and rich. And Chile is, and Switzerland are good places to live, and Sweden as well. These are good places, and they have achieved that balance, and we can learn from that. And I think that would be somehow that more exciting, positive story, because I think that will get us into this range of possibilities. Otherwise, you say, okay, it's hopeless. What do? I can't do anything about the Great Barrier Reef. But if I say, okay, I can actually copy Switzerland in some areas, that is much more encouraging. That's a bit the ozone layer story. When we were growing up, and the Prime Minister today said it on Canada, that was our scare. And fortunately, the world community, helped to solve that one. And that's, I think, what we need to do on climate change.
I want to ask about one more thing, and I'm afraid this is a somewhat negative one, so I apologize. But the question of misinformation is a crucial one, and there's so much more information out there. Some good stuff, not all good though. How can we empower audiences to be able to really critically evaluate the information that they encounter online, do you think? And this is a question for everybody. I don't know if, Manjira, this is something you've experienced in, or...
Yeah, I mean, I'll put it this way. There are plenty of initiatives trying to hack at misinformation. But if we take it from a sort of culture perspective, the most important thing for me that comes to mind is, I like to say, rehabilitating the right to think. We are living on such a grind ordinarily that sometimes, this information comes at us because, you want to believe it because you're sort of wired to it. But giving back people ways for people to think and think together, not just as sort of as an individualistic agenda, then these skills we talk about as media literacy programs, but really are things that we as cognitive beings already have, can then be at the fore of how we consume, what generates demand and supply. So at the heart of it is the questions we're dealing with is how do we coexist, right? Different people, injustices have been there of time and place and so on. A lot of that is what is being wired to create mis and disinformation. And it's really fears and anxieties about our place in the world. If we go to the heart of that, if we face the eye of that storm, it's a cultural issue. How do we live in a globalized world? How do I make sense of the fact that I live in Nairobi, and suddenly, because the cost of living is, I have a good enough life, and somebody in New York wants to decamp to Nairobi, there'll be room for both of us, or the other way. If it were possible for me to move to New York. At the heart of that, in different spheres of misinformation, that is the challenge. So we can hack away with programs and media literacy and training people, but the core of it is figuring out through stories, through, forums, fireside chats, whatever it is that it will take for us to find ways to live together and coexist in this world.
Anthony, misinformation is something that could be turbocharged by artificial intelligence. So do you have thoughts on the kind of the coming challenges that could be presented by this new technology in terms of its power to boost misinformation?
This is a massively complicated area. I mean, I'm making a theatrical documentary at the moment with a number of the top AI people in the world, and every week now I'm shocked by what they're finding. And the idea that we look at our little chatbots and thinks that's where it's at is absolutely not. It's so big, it's so prolific, it's so out there, and in the next 2 years it's going to change radically. So I think, any changes we're going to make, we're going to have to make on an ongoing basis. I think one of the interesting things about this is we keep saying, AI is going to do this, AI is going to do that. But one of the things that's coming out of the film is that we have to take control ourselves. It's a bit like when a pandemic happens, people change their attitudes. We've got to realize that actually what's happening is going to be a bit like a pandemic. It's going to change lots of things. And I think we have to wake up and change our own attitude. And it's only the human race that is going to deal with AI, the negative side of AI. And that, what we're going to do is very difficult. I mean, one solution I know a number of people I know are looking at is to try and deal with it on a personal level, to try to create some kind of world around your own world that can protect you from some of the things that AI could do. And it would be using AI to obviously defeat AI. That's a possible solution. But I think at the moment, it's quite honestly so big, the threat. There's lots of positive sides about AI, but the threat of what I call the bad force of AI is so severe, I don't think we can even begin to work out how to deal with it. We can deal with it on a daily basis of fake news or deep fakes, but we're really going to have to put our heads together on this one. And I think all the top people that I know heads are full with how are we going to deal with the dark force of AI, and it's going to be very severe. especially when you put quantum computing on top of it, then you've really got some evil things going on.
Well, on that ominous note, we've got about 10 minutes left for some questions. If anybody in the audience has any burning questions, I think we've got a roving microphone that can pick them up. Anybody? I can see a hand up over here. I believe we've got a microphone somewhere, but somewhere backstage. I'll tell you what, would you like to shout your question and I can repeat it, or I don't know where our microphone... here we are, Ramia. Have you got the microphone?
Oh, we got one.
The gentleman over here. Thank you. And if you could just briefly introduce yourself, that would be great. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sam. I'm a writer and a filmmaker from New York. I had a question for Anthony. You had mentioned how YouTube has infiltrated the content sphere and filmmaking sphere with, you know, so many smaller films, and not even really films. I mean, it's just content that's just being pushed out, and the head of YouTube had believed that he was going to make, you know, however many Spielbergs. But I know from experience, just being in the film scene in New York, that there are so many incredible filmmakers that are coming out and making the best independent films that we've ever seen. I think we're in a golden era of that. And that's because the access has become so much greater, because so many kids couldn't go to film school or they didn't have the right connections for it. And now some of my friends are getting nominated for Cannes and Sundance and, you know, going that far all off of YouTube. And meanwhile, we have the situation in Hollywood where, you know, there's the strike and people are getting hired for 2 weeks at a time and, you know, can't afford their rent, working on some of the biggest TV shows and films, and, you know, they'll get hired for 6 months and then they'll get laid off because a studio will just pull the funding. And we were apparently in a golden age of TV a second ago, and now we have way too much. So what is the solution to this at this point? I mean, we have all this oversaturated content, but it's really making so much more access for people that couldn't even dream to be in certain spaces before. But meanwhile, the greater institutions don't seem to really care about quality anymore.
I think what you're saying is absolutely right. I actually see a world in 4 or 5 years' time where the broadcasters and people like Netflix are going to have less influence, because I see new platforms emerging which budding filmmakers can go onto. I mean, people like Apple have access to 2 billion customers. There are other people who have access. There are new pipes forming. And in some ways, you could argue that, you know, broadcasters were a thing of the past. And what's important is the creative community and what they do, not the middle people who take chunks of money out of the whole process. And I think that the whole process is rife for change. And I think we're really in an era of where creators are going to start taking control again. And creators will have a relationship with the audience. It won't necessarily be, you know, when you have a Netflix film, it's a Netflix film, but there are great creative talent, you're totally right. And I'd love to see that creative talent having communication across the globe directly. Forget all the boundaries. When we you know, come out with something, we can broadcast it to the world. So I see a radical shake-up happening. And I see the new pipes, as I call them, as very exciting. I see the fact that, you know, we can put on forget the headset, the Apple Pro, but put on a headset which is 16K and sit now and watch a movie in a different way. I see that as radically different. So I absolutely agree with everything you're saying, and I see we're going to see a shake-up.
Let's have a question from I think there's a gentleman behind me with a question.
Hi, my name is Michael Garin. I was the former head of Image Nation here in Abu Dhabi. I completely agree that technology has democratized information. This is not a question, it's really an observation and a caution, which is we have to be very careful it doesn't also lead to the homogenization of information, because as Anthony just said, we're going to have access to a global audience, but the stories that they want to hear are not global stories, they're local stories. And so my caution is not to try to create content for the world, but try to create authentic stories that work in your city, your town, your village, your country, and let the world discover it. And that will be what will empower people to be successful in this new environment.
Would anybody like to respond?
Michael, you're right, totally. I mean, it's both that work, but I think that the new platforms can do both. They can both look after and be very popular within their local region. But I love the fact that, you know, I'm watching more Korean films than I've ever watched before in my life. I think that's fantastic. I'm watching more films from Africa, and I think that's very exciting. And I think that's a new world. But I agree totally. It needs to also concentrate on its own language and its own area.
I was just really quickly going to say, I think the challenge there is what we call local and what we call global. I think at the end of the day, a story, a human story that connects, and it was said in the previous panel too, things that help us relate. Those are the things that will matter. The challenges, industry so far has prefaced something called global and others as sort of peripheral, and that is being challenged by the fact that the democratization of devices and the need to see the world for what it is calls for a different way of organizing ourselves.
And yeah, maybe, Tom, I want to bridge this to your previous point on how to fight misinformation. I think one way, again, there's some parts with, that Anthony spoke about which are a bit more challenging and outside my wheelhouse, but other things are make it simple and make it add up. And I'll use an example from economics and one from sport that links to what you said. So India just gave out a big new household survey. Until now, if you Google and check the World Bank or other players, they still think India is a poor country, a very poor country with a very low middle class. BMW had a target of selling a certain number of cars. They reached the target within 1 month. Massive misunderstanding of this market and the situation. The World Bank and others think there is 80 million Indians in the middle class. There's 300 million cars. It doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. The 80 million number is wrong. You need to work on your data. But it's very simple to understand that the 300 million is larger than 80 million and just put it out. Second example, when I was traveling in Africa in the 90s, and I'm still a avid soccer fan, my friend from Germany sent me cut out the soccer table from Monday, and I got it a week later, and then I was happy to note that 10 days ago my club, Bayern Munich, had played a certain game. Today is very different. Today we look at it in real time, and it's democratizing. You can even almost play as an amateur player, and at least virtually, to follow your team, and you know all the elements, because it does add up. You always know when it's 2-1 what happens to the league in real time, and that's very empowering and very transparent. And I think that kind of soccer analogy, which we have seen huge professionalization, where low-rate players can now earn a lot of money, should apply to other spaces. And if you do simple systems that add up, we get in that direction.
Agreed. Do we have more questions? I don't know if anybody has one that they haven't had a chance to ask yet. Not at the moment? Okay. Well, while you're thinking... Oh, are we up? I'm not sure what that indicates.
Live.
I think we've got 5 minutes left, if that's okay. I was if while audiences are thinking,
that was just to warm you up again.
Sounded like the restart noise on an Apple, didn't it?
Reboot.
Oh, we have a question over here. If somebody could bring the microphone over here, please, that would be great. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Diane Henry-Lapart. I now live in Abu Dhabi, which is a great place. It's all established. I'm, in my cultural portfolio, one of the, I say, global instigators behind the idea of a new museum of contemporary arts in the Caribbean, world-class standard. So I'll stop there. But in terms of my question to the panelists, technology obviously is taking a pace, and it's changing things rapidly across a number of verticals, including culture. What do you see as the end game in relation to culture?
Would anybody like to take that first?
Wow, that's a profound question, just because you can look at it from the impulses of what's driving the way society is, or we can look at it from the perspective of we could still make the future that we want. And if I take it through the lens of artificial intelligence, to what Anthony was speaking to, I was struck by what you were saying and the fact that the people you're working with for the film sound like they're thinking very individualistically and from a very narrow worldview. And this is a problem with AI so far, is the development of it has coded certain biases, few biases about the world and our place in it, that culture and cultures of the world could completely change what AI is about, if allowed. But for that to happen, a number of things then start to come into play. We have to make sure that it's not just about getting the same kind of tools in a certain place, but also enabling people to create the same tools and contribute to the commons. So they find this tension about individualistic approaches, winner takes all, or communal-based approaches, and it's an age-old question of culture. I come from the culture, you all probably are familiar with Ubuntu. I am because you are. If we had that build AI, we'd have a very relational approach to artificial intelligence, but we won't know until we try. So we could end up in a situation where certain cultures are then the end-all be-all that is encoded into a world where artificial intelligence is driving things. Or it could be that we completely learn the world again because there's an opportunity for diversity to be brought in. The question is that interpersonal process that will make it possible.
Would anybody like to respond to that?
I think there's a sort of opportunity here, though. AI and other tools give people an access to culture that they haven't had before. You know, break down some of those terrifying barriers. So, you know, who knows where it's going to go? But I do think there's an opportunity, and I don't, you know, I absolutely do not want to give the wrong impression here that the future is the Apple Vision Pro. That's part of it. I mean, you can do things immersively with phones. We're teaching kids to tell their own stories immersively just through a mobile phone. You know, and I think that the AI world is very exciting, enabling people to go on journeys in cultures and in the arts in a way we've never done before, and I think that's really exciting.
Well, that's a nice positive note, possibly on which to wrap up. So thank you very much for a fascinating panel. Thank you very much to the audience.